afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, or good night, and welcome to this Experio seminar hosted by the Swedish National Policy Lab, Experio Lab, also embedded lab into one of the Swedish Region Värmland. My name is Kalle Pettersson, and I work as a policy designer. But before we begin, please note, as I just said, that this session will be recorded, as with all our Experio seminars. So you can revisit this seminar along with our previous sessions by logging in at www.experiolab.se. And before we begin, I'd like to promote the Experio monthly newsletter by subscribing at www.experiolab.se/newsletter. You'll stay up to date with the latest seminar information and also other happenings in the Experio Lab community. And before we begin this seminar, please let me also introduce the remaining seminar of our exciting lineup of speakers for the autumn sessions. And the last one out is in a month's time, December the 5th. We have Gaia Tafoni. She's a research fellow at the School of Transnational Governance, a European University Institute in Florence, Italy. And Gaia will talk on the subject of anticipation meets politics, designing evidence-informed governance. And Gaia is a political scientist that has been doing a lot of research on policy labs all around Europe and very much at the EU Policy Lab. So don't miss that one on December the 5th. But now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. It's Allison Matthews from Mayo Clinic, and that is a hospital and research center based in the USA. So welcome, Allison. The Zoom room is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen. I'm just absolutely honored to be here. So thank you for inviting me. I'll start with a little bit of kind of background and kind of explain what I'm going to try to accomplish here today. But I will first say that I am a very casual presenter. I'm not at all offended or disrupted by questions that come in the middle, but I might not be able to see the chat. So either someone else can call it out or they're very welcome to just start talking. It won't bother me at all. I have been a designer at Mayo Clinic for over 15 years. Mayo Clinic is a healthcare organization in the United States. We have about over 70,000 employees, over 8,000 physicians, and we are a tertiary care center, which means that we support patients that have very serious and complex disease. And we focus on that. So patients often come to us when they have something that cannot be solved by their local providers or their local care teams or even local university hospitals. I am in Rochester, Minnesota. We also have campuses in Arizona and in Florida. And it is 6:30 in the morning here. So if I stumble over my words a little bit, it's because I have not had breakfast. But I hope that you will take that with, well, you just come along on the journey with me. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my passion in healthcare design, which is really thinking about the relationships between our care teams and our patients and their caregivers as an infrastructure that supports great healthcare delivery. As I thought about what I would present today, I talked to my team, and I'm going to start with a case study that goes through CAR T cell therapy, and I'll talk a little bit about what that is in a minute. And then some of my friends who are even on the call, Manuela knows that I just love tidbits from other experiments and projects that I've done. So after I wrap up the case study on CAR T cell therapy, you're just going to get kind of a smorgasbord of things that I think are interesting, and I would love to engage in a discussion with all of you around those things. So here we go. CAR T cell therapy. The group who was starting up a CAR T cell therapy service line at Mayo Clinic came to me and my team, and they asked for an app. CAR T cell therapy is chimeric antigen receptor T cell therapy. This is a therapy for patients who have serious cancer.
Men jag har ingen mikrofon på.
What was that? Oh, it is for patients who have serious cancer. And what they do is they extract the T cells from your blood. They then genetically modify the T cells to be more effective at treating the cancer, and then put it back into your body, and hopefully get a better result for your cancer treatment. When we started this project, CAR T cell therapy was just moving from a research trial into clinical care. And so in the United States, because we have a commercial insurance system, we need to come up with a commercially viable and competitive in the marketplace experience and service line to support people coming to Mayo Clinic for this. So they wanted an app. And in, I think, what every designer loves to do is we discovered something completely different, and gave them something that they didn't necessarily ask for, but became quite happy with. We had an opportunity to shadow these patients. We shadowed 23 patients from end to end in their experience. We went home with them at the very beginning. We were in their hotels with them when they were here in Minnesota. We went to all of their appointments with them. We went to all of their hospital stays. We spent time with their caregivers when they weren't with the patients. We spent time with all of the care team. And so we were able to map the entire service line end to end very robustly. One of the things that was incredibly profound is that this is an incredibly complex and new technology for healthcare. What we found, though, was that the needs of the patients and even of the care team were quite simple and remained the same as ones that we had seen in other circumstances. We also found, though, that because it was so complex, it was difficult for people to understand that their human needs were still quite simple. So they wanted to layer on top the idea that the complexity would make their needs much more complex. We mapped the journey from end to end on this journey map. This is not intended for you to need to read, but this is just to show you kind of basically how we broke things down. We broke it down into 6 phases. There's an evaluation phase where they determine whether or not you're eligible for CAR T cell therapy. They then collect your T cells. Those go off and then they process. There's chemotherapy and infusion. The chemotherapy prepares you to receive the T cells back. There's care after the infusion, and then the patients return home. We mapped what they were doing, what they were thinking and feeling. This kind of line here shows the level of anxiety and stress that the patients had, which then we supported with different quotes. We mapped their pain points, and then we mapped the opportunity spaces. You can see here at the top that patients had many, many appointments. Every dot represents at least an appointment, and these dots over here represent a stay in the hospital. And you can also see that there are points when there is significant intensity and when they're having a lot of appointments, and then there were points when we weren't having a lot of contact with the patients, which created challenges in and of itself. So that's kind of an overview of the experience that they were having, and I'll go into more detail later on. We came up with a few insights that really guided what we saw as the root cause challenges in this service line that made it different from others. The first one is that we found that the resource exhaustion for the patients and the caregivers was very significant. Our patients, in order to qualify for this treatment at this time, needed to have failed 3 other cancer treatments. So this means they probably had chemotherapy, several types of chemotherapy, could have been on another research trial, often had had a bone marrow transplant. And so they had gone through several courses of treatment. And in order to qualify for this, they were likely on a path to not be able to survive more than a few months. Because of our reimbursement system in the United States and all of that care that they had just received, many of these patients were out of money. Many of them were out of time because they were kind of very, very sick. And many of these patients had had caregivers who had exhausted the amount of time that they could take off of work in an allowable way. So if I would typically have taken my husband with me as my caregiver, maybe for the second round of treatment that I had, I brought my sister. And then the third round of treatment, maybe I brought my mother. And by the time that they were at this treatment, we were talking to their neighbors, we were talking to their children's teachers, who are kind of filling in the gaps when their loved ones were unable to be there. Another thing that we found was because clinically, the process for CAR T cell therapy was very similar to autologous stem cell transplant, or what some people sometimes call BMT. We were finding that our team was defaulting to providing patient education for these autologous stem cell transplants and just crossing out what didn't matter for a CAR T cell therapy patient or what was different. Interestingly, most of these patients had already had this treatment, and so they were able to express that while clinically it was very similar, in terms of the experience, it was very, very different. So this education was not useful for the patients, but we felt as though we had kind of checked a box of giving the patients education. We also found that we create divisions in healthcare that don't necessarily support the patient. So we have divisions between the types of care that we provide, so cardiology versus neurology. We have divisions between their local care providers and the Mayo Clinic care providers. We have divisions between how we provide care in an inpatient hospital setting and in an outpatient setting. These patients were undergoing this very complex care that involved many, many team members, but the siloed nature of it made it difficult for us to create a cohesive experience for our patients. We also found, and this is, I'll give you kind of an embarrassing bias that I tend to have in healthcare, is that when I see something going wrong in healthcare, my immediate knee-jerk reaction that I have to fight hard against is to think that there's a bad actor in the system. Like someone must be doing something wrong in the system. And inevitably, what I find when I map the systems is that everybody is trying to do their very best, but they're often impeded by a lack of coordination or a lack of understanding of what's happening before them and what's happening after them. So throughout the process, we were seeing patients have all of these different touch points with our care teams. But what we would find is that, let's say you go to schedule your appointment, and they say to you, at your pharmacy appointment, Manuela will talk to you about your medications. And then you get to your pharmacy appointment, and Manuela talks about something else, because that's not her role in the process right now. And instead, she talks to you about the chemotherapy that you're going to have, but nothing about the medications that you're taking today. And so it's not that the person, at the scheduling was trying to give you wrong information, but they did by accident. And now you either think someone doesn't understand you, someone in the team isn't communicating well, someone has forgotten to do something, and trust becomes lost. And so a big problem that we saw was that different people at different points of the process didn't understand what was happening before them or after them. So things were either getting dropped or lost, misconceptions were being formed, or there was significant redundancy in the work that was happening. We also found that the burden of connection fell to the patients. And so they'd say something like, in your next appointment, make sure you tell them that you had a fever yesterday. And I think people who are in the healthcare system know that that probably went into the clinical note. And someone was, to their best intentions, trying to help the patient have the best appointment that they could have. But what happened is that the patient felt like it was their work that they needed to do to constantly keep everyone up to date. Or they'd say something like, what happened in your last appointment? They wanted to hear it from the patient's perspective. They knew from the clinical note what had happened in the last appointment, but that wasn't made clear to the patient. So the patient felt that it was their responsibility to relay all of this information back and forth. So because they wanted an app, we said, okay, we will test the concept of an app, but we're going to do it with a paper prototype. We're not going to build you a full app. And one big thing that we learned in this particular case, and I'll talk a little bit about how this isn't globally applicable to everything, is that the physical paper of this prototype enabled what we didn't think that digital would ever do, is create some collaborative care and these relationship models that greatly improved the experience that both our patients and our care teams had. So I'll talk a little bit about that. What we did is we started first with creating what would, in their eyes, eventually become an app and an app screen. But for every single interaction that our patients would have, we created kind of a 2-page spread. In this spread, we talked to each patient about what would happen at their appointment. We talked about the main points that would be discussed. And then we took questions that we had gathered from the observations that we'd done that were commonly asked or that their team recommended that they ask at this time. We also then added a lot of space for questions and notes. Initially, when we were thinking about this being a digital concept, we thought that, then the patient kind of in the digital part would open it up and be able to put the notes in. What really shifted our mindset to move away from digital and toward paper was we recognized that our patients and their caregivers were writing notes in this, but we also noticed that their care team was writing notes in it. So if I'm in my CAR-T hematology appointment, excuse me, and I had my appointment coming up with Manuela, the pharmacist again, and I had a question about my medication, what the provider would do is say, let's write that on the page further in the workbook for your pharmacist, so that when we get to the pharmacy appointment, it's pre-populated with the personalized questions that I had. That's something that we realized that a provider would never have taken someone's personal device, their iPad or their phone or anything, and typed that in. But we did see that they were willing to collaborate over a paper prototype. We also found these really interesting things as these patients had neurotoxicity. So what happens in CAR T cell therapy is once the T cells become effective in your body, they cause the cancer cells to kind of explode. And that creates a lot of cell material in your body that isn't normally there. And because of that, patients would experience neurotoxicity, which means that they would be confused, they would have violent outbursts, they would become very tired. Some lost the ability to speak, some lost the ability to walk. And this was a temporary thing that lasted about a week for them, but it was very alarming. And I will say that as I shadowed the patients from appointment to appointment, and every single appointment that I could go to, one thing that I learned is that they were told about this neurotoxicity in a clinical way probably 25 times. It was really the drumbeat of all of the appointments. And then we get to the point after their infusion when they would have neurotoxicity, and the patients and their caregivers would say, I had no idea this was going to happen. And I was kind of dumbfounded. I said, like, how could you not know this? And one thing that we realized was that the way that this was being described to the patients was in ways that they couldn't imagine in the future. So they're being given very clinical terms, and they really needed to understand it from an experiential perspective. So we had these really profound statements like, my husband became verbally abusive to nurses, and that has never happened before. So what we did is we revised the pages that we put into this workbook around neurotoxicity. We kept the part where we talked about it clinically, but then we put in a whole section about what it is like to experience the neurotoxicity. And then we also put in just direct quotes from the patients. And we put in a separate section about what it is for the caregivers to experience the neurotoxicity and quotes from them. This almost immediately fundamentally shifted how patients experience this. And the interesting part was, as we talked about the caregivers and how they're rotating at this point because people are kind of out of time, after some patients had read this, they realized that they may say things or do things that they won't remember, but their caregivers will experience very deeply. And so they actually changed which caregiver was going to come with them for that week. So they'd say, my spouse might be very offended if I say something unkind, but my neighbor who just doesn't like how I shovel the snow, how he shovels the snow, won't be nearly as offended and can kind of be prepared and brush it off. So it really changed how the patients were engaging with this experience. like I said, we really found that the patients also carry the burden of their journey. And this is during it, but then after it. And so, what would always happen is that patients would complete their treatment at Mayo Clinic, and then we'd go home with them and experience their first appointment with their local care provider. And at Mayo Clinic, when you finish a course of treatment, we send all of your medical records, we send a detailed letter that explains what happened. And then we also send a detailed letter that explains what care the local provider should remain responsible for, and then what care we would prefer that you come back to Mayo Clinic for so that we can support that. Inevitably, what would happen is the local care provider would say, "What happened at Mayo Clinic?" And the local care provider may have read all of those things, and they may just want to hear it from the patient's perspective, or they may not have read it. And the patients felt this incredible burden. So what we did is we created kind of a fill in the blank system where at their last appointment at Mayo Clinic, the provider, the doctor at Mayo Clinic would fill out with the patient all these kind of fields that would allow the patient, when they went home, to just read this page and a couple other pages to their local provider. Say, this is what happened. And this was very successful. It also has another page that talks about, when you should call Mayo Clinic when I'm sick enough to go back. It was really interesting, though. The patients used this as well to talk to their neighbors and their loved ones to be able to explain what happened. So we gave them, in simple terms, a way to accurately describe what was going on, which they found really incredibly useful. We also, initially, when we did this experiment, created one giant workbook. We even at first had created kind of a binder, and we thought at each appointment, someone could put these binder pages into it. That became unwieldy very quickly. Not only did people kind of put their page in, but they all had like an extra pamphlet for something that they knew that the patient would love. And it became very overwhelming. And the binders became kind of ridiculously heavy because someone had the animal therapy section. And would you like to talk to this dietitian? And did you know that you can get a discount at this restaurant? And you could stay at this hospitality house. And so all of these things were being added into this binder, which just kind of really suffocated all of the good information that we had put in. We also found that if you get all of the information when you're just looking to qualify for CAR T cell therapy, that felt like really an overwhelming experience. And patients were like, I was just drowning in patient education. So we said, how can we not give them just in time information? So you're just getting everything kind of at the moment you're getting the care, but how can we make it a little bit more progressive? So we created 3 volumes. The first volume was for the evaluation and the collection process. This way, if you don't qualify for the process, you don't kind of see what you're missing because you're likely going into palliative care at that point. Then we created one for the infusion and the aftercare. And the last one we created was about transitioning home and the resources that they needed to do that. This was really interesting. We were excited about these workbooks, but we weren't sure how well they were being utilized. And so 2 kind of experiences that we had really changed how we thought about these. The first was typically when a patient would come to Mayo Clinic, the first appointment they would have would be with a nurse coordinator who would talk to them about the processes that they were going to be undergoing. And they would hand them the first workbook and talk to them about how they would use it. For some reason, there was needed to be some condensed scheduling for one patient, and they actually saw a social worker first. And the social worker, I was standing on the floor, like busts out of the exam room and says, "Where is this patient's workbook? I cannot have my appointment without this patient's workbook." And it was really exciting to see that it had been picked up by the team, and they really saw this as something that was integral to how they worked as a team. The other one was after meeting with a caregiver, they showed us their workbook, and it was coffee stained and dog-eared, and it had post-it notes and all these things. And one of the things that they talked about is that this is the handoff that they did between caregivers, which this is something also that I think would have been challenging with a digital aspect, that they really saw this as the you are now in charge moment. This is your responsibility and we're taking it on. Even in the hospital, we would see like a daughter go for lunch, and before she went for lunch, she handed the workbook to her mother, and said, "You hold this while I go to lunch, and then I'll come back and get it." And so it became that precious that this was something that was kind of always in their possession. So we did not create an app for them. I will say now that it has evolved over time, it has QR codes in so you can scan it and go to more detailed information. So it of course has a digital component. It interfaces with their medical record, all of that. But it really became this physical aspect, and it was a relationship infrastructure, not just for the patients and the caregivers, but for the care team to even kind of communicate and coordinate their care for these patients. This is a quote that we got from a caregiver afterward that I don't think I've ever asked, like, gotten a better quote from an interview. But this one said, "Do you know what it's like when you've been invited to a dinner party and when you arrive, you are warmly greeted by the host? You can smell your favorite food cooking and the table has been set with the best china. When you are seated, you can tell the host carefully selected who you sit next to, so you have a wonderful conversation with a new friend, and the whole evening feels like it was designed for you." That is how I feel about these workbooks. I feel like Mayo Clinic has customized our care and is graciously hosting us throughout the entire process. And so it was this really like lovely quote. But when I reflected on it, I realized everything we had put in that workbook was pretty generic. Every patient is given the exact same workbook, but the way that we had paced it and the way that we had put it together and then the way that we had had the team engage with it made it feel like a very, very customized experience for every single patient. I will say that when this was very successful, other groups started coming to us. And one was a group in cardiology that was doing a surgery with patients that was kind of a 2-night stay in the hospital. And they said, we're having a hard time communicating and our patient experience scores aren't very good. And we would like to put in workbooks. And it did not work. It did not work at all. This workbook concept is effective when it is a longitudinal, complex system that requires a lot of different team members. Otherwise, it becomes very burdensome for people to kind of keep up with on a fast-paced care model. So I'll just give that caveat. But then thinking about what could I learn from this that could be applied to other things is that now when I am doing observations, I really try to observe relationships and not just people. Every time I build a patient journey, I try to build it in with either one or multiple caregivers. I try to build in a layer of what the care team is experiencing during these times. And I try to think about not just the doctor and the nurse. I try to think about the scheduler and the social worker and the person rooming the patients. I think about the security staff at the door. I try to really be much broader. When we're prototyping, we prototype not just the functionality, but the relationship impacts. And when we're designing, we try to create a design that can evolve. And so with this workbook, because it's a page for each encounter, you can imagine it's a system that you could add another encounter at any time. You could take one out, you can change things. But so we created a system that they could leverage. And because we did that, we are now 5 years down, 8 years down almost now. And they are still using this and still adapting it. And I'll say it's very sweet. They still have these like big group meetings where they invite everyone who is involved in the different cell therapy processes. So it's not just CAR T now, but it's other cellular molecular bispecific therapies. But they'll bring in the courier who takes the cells from Mayo Clinic to the airport and say, what is it that you do so that when I tell the patients how your cells are getting to the airport, I can describe it accurately. And so they often bring me in to kind of moderate these conversations because they're used to me now, but they're very sweet in their desire to just deeply understand the entire process. So to kind of close off this case study, I think that while healthcare grows more complex, The need for connection remains profoundly important, and the human needs remain very static. The power of really intentionally designing relationships creates a very essential and kind of long-lasting infrastructure. So I have more, and I'll talk more, but I just wanted to pause and see if there are any questions at this point.
Allison, hi, it's Jan. Hey, I was looking in the chat. So somebody's asked a question. Were you able to see the differences between needs groups and age groups in regards to how they used or reacted to the paper prototype?
Yeah, so really good question. And I think it's a little bit of a spoilers alert for later, and Manuel has heard this story before, but one of the things that we have found is that in healthcare, um, people's reaction to elements like this depends largely on their previous experience with healthcare and the seriousness and complexity of their disease, more so than other demographic elements. And so I'll talk about that a little bit more in more depth, but it's really interesting that we have found that the segmentation is not as it would be typically in other industries. Okay, I will start with the other kind of driving insights that I have, but again, really interrupt me at any moment. It will not offend me at all. So these are just a potpourri of things that I think are interesting, and I hope you also find them to be interesting. So my first one is that in healthcare, no matter how ambitious the transformation, human behavior will always be the defining factor because in high stress environments, people's instincts and coping patterns inevitably shape the outcomes more than our systems or structures. And I'll give you some examples around that. At Mayo Clinic, we're a tertiary care center where people often come and our care is very excellent. And because of that, it's interpreted sometimes as high end. Our spaces are very nice. And so when we're designing things, people often say, you should think about what the Ritz-Carlton does. You should think about how Disney tracks people and understands their preferences. You should think about how the Four Seasons hotels offer the amazing cabanas on the beach. And I have to kind of constantly remind people that the very best experience that you can ever have at Mayo Clinic or in healthcare in general is to never, ever have to interact with it, to be a healthy person and never get to the point, especially at Mayo Clinic, where you require tertiary care, where you are so sick that someone in your local area cannot find a way to help you be better. And so we have to constantly remember that the experiences that people are having in healthcare can certainly be informed by excellent hospitality and excellent kind of experience management. But fundamentally, people are experiencing the scariest day of their entire life, the most intense decisions that they've ever had to make. They are being separated from their normal life and their normal systems. And this is something that's very normal for us. These two nice ladies probably help people get into this machine 200 times a day. But for this patient, this is the only time that it will ever happen in their life, and it is scary. And so we have to constantly remind ourselves that we're not trying to create a hospitality experience. We're trying to create an experience that helps people feel cared for, helps people feel reassured, helps people feel as though they're being listened to, and that their kind of human nature and human elements are the most critical parts. If we can insert some nice hospitality, we should absolutely do that. And if there are global lessons that we can learn, but if we start to just mimic how Disney has wristbands that tell you where everybody is because we want to understand how people want to get their food or things like that, we will fail very quickly. The second insight that I'd like to share is that the patient journey is not only unique to each individual, but also continually evolving for the same patient as their needs and circumstances change. So when we build patient journeys or patient personas, it's very easy to think about the first time that someone arrives at Mayo Clinic and to think about how this is really the defining experience that they will have. When we think about a cancer patient, there may be moments when they come for the very first time and they want to deeply understand through our spaces and through the ways that we interact with them what our care model is, how qualified we are to provide them that care, and how reliable we are as a care provider. So we often have patients who are coming for the first time come into some of our grandest lobbies. And we have columns that are like a bank that says, we are stable, we are sturdy, we have expertise, we are a professional organization that can support you. In these spaces, they see our care teams walking by and collaborating, and they understand that they are supporting other patients and that they will get support like this. So that's what they want the first time they come. But then let's say they're coming every single day for 2 months for chemotherapy. They don't tend to want to walk through our grand lobby. Often they don't feel well. And so we create smaller, more intimate spaces for patients to be able to come in and be able to quickly come in, maybe not even wait and just go immediately back to be supported by the care team. Or you could imagine an experience where a patient is coming in for surgery and they almost would like to drive their car into the building, be wrapped up in a warm blanket, and have the care team say, we will take it from here, we will care for you, and then this is how we will care for your loved one who will be waiting for you. And so it's really important to understand that as you build journeys or think about personas, that the experiences that these patients have over time evolves as much as the patients do between each other. The next one is to truly transform care. We must deeply understand the moments between the clinical encounters, where much of the patient's experience and healing actually unfold. And so we often think of things in silos. So we have, and I'm, working on building a building right now where we think about arrival, which is different from your clinical admission, which is different from your clinical care, which is different from your discharge, which is different from you departing the building. And we have all of these different segments that we have very neatly decided who works on which thing and what we need from you at each point. For the patient, this is an overall continuum of care. And so because of that, when I'm asked to help design spaces, one thing that they almost always come to me with is, could you get rid of the lobbies in our spaces? And I'll talk a little bit about the importance of lobbies to each area. But first, I'll say, when we think about lobbies, the clinical teams think about this as non-useful space that's maybe not doing a lot of work. And so could we condense this, get more exam rooms, get more operating rooms, and could we make this more efficient? Could we even make it so that the patient could bypass this and so that they could go straight to an exam room or to the operating room? So I get to spend a lot of time in waiting rooms and I sit there with the patients, and I've learned 2 really important things, I think, here. First is that patients do a lot of work in these spaces, and not their job work. They do a lot of work of talking to their loved one about how they're going to describe their symptoms. They do a lot of writing down of their questions. They do a lot of preparation just mentally for having these types of discussions. They also spend time there decompressing and getting ready for what's going to happen. And then on the flip side, when they come out, they might call their sister or explain what happened. So these become really important spaces for the patients. Had a second point and it's escaping me right now, but it'll come back.
Allison, Allison, got some questions. If you
Yes.
do you mind me These aren't
Go
my
for it.
questions. I'm just acting as your chat secretary.
Thank
So
you.
we got one from, no worries, one from Gerald who says, I wonder if you looked at the benefits on the other side. Are the staff also experiencing benefits to their work situation from a well-being perspective? I think that means in terms of the workbooks, I
Yes,
would
actually,
suggest.
the teams were quite happy with those. They were actually able to better understand what was happening. They felt more confident in the work that they were doing and the information that they were providing to the team and to the patients. So it really became a much more cohesive team, and they were able to work together much better. That's great.
And we got a question from Yasina, who asked, they asked, with their evolving journey, how do you design for change in the informal relations of patients over time, like the shift in who is coming with patients to appointments that you mentioned? Any ideas?
That's a really good question. I think for us so far, what it has really been is an acknowledgement of that fact, has been as much of a design intervention as anything else. For us to be able to say, we can't assume that the same person is always coming. And being able to prepare our team for that if they have relied on a particular caregiver and then all of a sudden it's a different one. So being able to do that and then also prepare the patient for the idea that they may not know yet that their caregiver will evolve, but we anticipate that it likely will. And so we're able to do that. So that's been really helpful. Sorry, that's kind of a non-answer, but just it's pretty simple.
Alison, can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
Around unplanned admissions. So, for example, with CART therapy, there's a really high risk of infections and sepsis and uncontrolled pain and things like that. Did you take on the challenge for unplanned admissions as well, or would that be too much
No, that's a
in the
great
work?
question. What we actually did is we set up, so typically, just so that everyone's aware, in a situation like this patient probably would have had to go to our emergency department and likely would have been seen by another doctor. The symptoms that they were experiencing could often have been immediately relieved by giving them steroids. The problem with giving these patients steroids is that it counteracts the CAR T cell therapy and invalidates the entire therapy immediately. And so it's a really bad idea for us to give them to the emergency department, at least without enough information. So we did two things. One is we set up the hospital service so that they could accept patients. So the people working in the hospital could accept patients even if they weren't going to be admitted to the hospital. And they had some spaces in the hospital where they could give the patient an infusion, where they could give them antibiotics, where they could give them pain medication. They can help them work with the immediate issue, and then they could send them back home without having to admit them. So we did that. We also, when they went home, because they probably were still going to show up at the emergency department, gave them a sheet of paper that went with them to the emergency department that in big red letters at the top said, first, call Mayo Clinic. Someone will answer the phone. It's the same people who are helping people in the hospital. And then these are the things that you can do to support this patient. And these are the things that we prefer that you not do unless it's an emergency. And since then, now we are equipping these patients with remote monitoring technology that helps us understand their body temperature, their blood pressure. We have them do a daily neurostatus check so that we can understand what's going on so that we can be more predictive in their needs rather than them getting to the point of an emergency and bringing them in proactively earlier.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Alison.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I'll keep going on waiting rooms, but keep asking me questions. The other thing that we learned about waiting rooms was patients, at least in the United States, act very similarly to how patients do. And I will say, because I've been to European airports, like you do in American airports. So when a person comes to an American airport, and let's pretend that they haven't flown very often, their tendency is to want to go immediately to the gate and to wait there. And they will, and just they want to see their airplane, they want to know where their gate is. And then they'll maybe go and get a bite to eat or go to a restaurant, but just very close by. We're finding that that's also the case in our waiting rooms in clinical areas. And so we ran an experiment on our Arizona campus where the concept was, and this is everybody's concept as their first idea for every building that I've been on, is that what if we can create these amazing amenities? Patients could wait wherever they want. We could use real-time location services and understand where they are in the building, and we tell them when to come back. So what we did is I became the real-time location services in this experiment. I called up to their local desk. I said, I'm with your patient. I will tell you, and I did this in front of the patient so they knew that I was in contact with the desk. And I'd say, I will tell you where we are. You give me a 10-minute warning. I will walk them back to your desk and we will get them checked in. And so I'd say to the patients, I have $50 to buy you lunch. I could buy you a coffee. We could go to the patient library. We could go for a walk. We were in Arizona. They had these beautiful desert walks. Said, I promise not to take you further than we can go. We can do whatever you want. Every single patient, I think I did this with about 25 patients, said, no, thank you. I would rather wait at the door, right by where my desk is. And I asked them about that. And they said, I have waited 6 months for this appointment. This is some of the most consequential conversations that I will have in my entire life. There's no way that I'm showing up late or going to miss this. And most of them really didn't even have an appetite anyway, or a desire to do anything else. And so as we think about these patients doing work in these lobbies, and then their desire to really have some control over the space that they hold near these appointments, we really find the importance in lobby spaces. This is the other one that kind of came with the question, so I didn't want to spoil the whole thing, but I'll go into much more detail now. But patient segmentation in healthcare must be understood in context. Unlike other industries, traditional segmentation models do not always apply because health needs and behaviors shift with circumstances, settings, and time. And so this is an experiment that we did similar to the lobbies, where in the lobbies, this was in like 2018, when kiosks like apps were the wave of the future. And they had thought, what if we can replace all of our check-in desks with kiosks? But they knew that there would be a learning curve. And so they wanted to understand where they should first install these kiosks and what ratio of human check-in to kiosks should we have at each desk. And they came with a hypothesis that said younger people will be more comfortable with kiosks because they're more comfortable with technology, and older people won't want to use them. So I went out and I made a bunch of fake kiosks with iPads on a stand and went out and interviewed patients. And this is where we really learned that the determining factor of whether or not people wanted to use technology in a healthcare setting was, one, their familiarity with the healthcare system and Mayo Clinic, and two, the seriousness of the condition that they were experiencing from their perspective. So what we found was that a 95-year-old woman who was coming for chemotherapy every single day was more than happy to check in on a kiosk because she'd been there a ton of times. She would push the button, she would go to her chemotherapy chair, and everything was seamless. But an 18-year-old kid who loves tech and loves gaming, who just found out that he had cancer, would like to come in and be greeted by a human being and be supported in a way that is not tech-enabled first. So what we really found is that rather than investing in the technology in the front of the office, we should invest in the technology in the back of the office to offload the tasks that we were asking the patients to do on the kiosk and enable our staff to create a very personalized welcome. And then in spaces where patients really wanted efficiency and they were feeling very comfortable, we can offer technology and allow them to engage with it there.
Allison, we got a
Yeah.
question in the chat room that might be interesting, I think, and that is from Sophie. She asking there might be a rather large difference in patient experience between USA and Sweden due to free versus expensive healthcare. I imagine all patients will love to be able to skip the lobby and meet the right people fast, no matter what it looks like. Do you have any insights on the role that the interior space plays and how it affects patients and caregivers?
That's a really good question. I haven't spent a lot of time in the healthcare system in Sweden. I've visited it, but I do think that the fact that the patients are paying a significant amount of money out of their pocket does impact the way that they experience and engage with healthcare. I think that things are put off and that they're held very, very precious when they do have access. So I do think that we design things in a way that also has to kind of capture a market. So I think those are some differences that I would probably see.
Thank you.
Yeah. The next one I have is that transformation is most successful when operational design and human behaviors complement space changes or any kind of changes. And without that thoughtful alignment, even well-designed interventions risk falling flat as people naturally revert to old habits. And so this is an example where we were redesigning a care space and a care team space specifically. And in many of our spaces, we kind of take 3 old exam rooms and we tear down the walls in between and we give the care team a space. And we were moving from an individually impaneled process where each doctor had their own patients to a care team process where an entire care team shared a bunch of patients. That meant, though, that we were going to take away the doctor's offices. And you have to imagine that that made me one of the most popular people at Mayo Clinic when that was coming up. But what we did is we created this care team room and we tried to understand what the root cause challenges and desires for people who had had offices, what they felt that they were losing. One thing that we learned was that they were worried that they were going to be constantly approached by their care team, which when they did have offices, they often were because they felt fairly inaccessible to the care team. So the care team, anytime they saw them, would kind of rush to them and get all of their questions answered. So what we did is we set up some operational parameters in this care team room. We asked the providers who were open for questions at that time to work in a standing position, and the people who needed heads down work to work in a sitting position. And then we asked the rest of the team to just respect that. And that dramatically changed their willingness to be in these rooms because they could have the heads down work and the privacy when they needed it. Interestingly, the people who liked to stand up, there were some people who just loved answering questions, so they stood up all the time. And there are other people in the care team who didn't love it, so they'd sit most of the time. So it's also given us insights now into how you form a care team effectively, so you don't end up with all sitters or all standers, but we can create different types of workflows in those spaces. We also created this idea of a casual spot to just be and to stand. And so anytime you said, come into this care team room, this is where people would just naturally linger. It doesn't have any technology. It doesn't have anything exciting. But if you had a question, this is kind of where you would stand and someone in the care team would come up and say, hey, can I help you out with that? And so rather than them lingering around people's desks or lingering over someone's shoulder, they could stand here and not ask a particular person, but could get their questions answered by anyone on the care team. Then we also created and this isn't the best example of it, but this is really a stand-up counter that was inside the care team room just immediately. And we knew that our nurses were coming in and out and in and out and in and out. And in other care team rooms, that was very disruptive because they were passing through the desks. And so we created these stations so they could just come immediately in and out, and it would support them. And so these are very small tweaks to a very boring care team room, but it fundamentally shifted how people used it because we based it in how their natural patterns were happening, and tried to alleviate the concerns that they had. This one, I mean this as respectfully as I possibly can, but I always like to say that observations and patient interviews are essential because care teams, no matter how experienced, cannot fully speak to the lived patient experience. We often, in healthcare, ask our care teams to represent the perspectives of our patients, and they do it remarkably well, but they cannot do the entire experience. And so I'll give you an example. I was invited to be a part of a project around awake craniotomy. So that means that during a surgery, the patient is woken up to either perform some tasks or for them to do some testing. And the provider that we were working with, the surgeon, knew that this was a very distressing experience for the patients. And so he had an idea, because there was trust between him and the patients, that if we were able to put a camera so that the surgeon could see the patient's face, the surgeon could then speak to the patient and calm them down. And I was a little dubious of this concept, because I can't imagine waking up in the middle of a surgery and having a camera in my face and finding that to be a comforting experience. So they came up with some other ideas. One was for me to have an iPad with pictures of their family that I would flip through. Another was to have an iPad with a bunch of movies that the patient liked. And so I would show them a movie while they were getting ready to do the testing. And so I loaded all of those things onto an iPad, and I went and spent time with the patient. And what I found was that the patient woke up, and I think if anyone here has had surgery and you wake up from anesthesia, that's a very confusing experience, regardless of whether or not you're in the middle of a surgery or you're not. It's cold in the operating room. Because these surgeries were unusual, many people were in there observing, so it was crowded and it was somewhat noisy. There are strange smells in operating rooms. There are strange noises. So these patients were waking up very disoriented. And me showing them pictures of their family was not helping anything. Let me just tell you that. That was, I think, equally disorienting. Like, why is my child in this room? The intervention that we ended up with was actually just having a psychologist or a social worker in the room. When the patient woke up, they just comforted them. They said, this is what is happening. This is what is going on. Everything is okay. We are here with you. And it was profound. The patient all of a sudden felt that. But I'll say the surgeon really wanted to support them and knew that they were a comforting voice. And so this camera was trying to do that. But they couldn't relay everything that the patient was experiencing, because this is the space where the surgeon lives most of their life. So these felt like normal experiences to them. So I just have to emphasize that it's so important for you to just try as much as you can to live the experience of the users that you're engaging with. Another example, go ahead.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Just around, so the CAR-T project had 23 patient observations, and you went to all the clinics, inpatient stays, went home. That's an incredible amount of access and trust. Also, I guess the question would be, in the context of Sweden, Norway, UK, or wherever it might be, we often work across sectors. So, for example, the hospital is one organization, whereas the mayor would be the hospital, the outpatient, the community care. It's such a big. So, my question to you is, how did you get that access? And do you have any advice on how to develop that kind of trust with the patient and that agreement across organizations that are different organizations?
Yeah, great questions. One, I will say I'm incredibly fortunate. I work within Mayo Clinic, and if I said for a project I need to see a heart transplant tomorrow, that would be a possible thing to happen. Like they can set that up. So I do have kind of unprecedented access. So I don't know that I have a lot of tips on how to get that access, because it's just something that I'm very fortunate to have. Your other question, though, about how to gain trust with the patients and the caregivers and the care team, is I've found that rather than having a very defined kind of set of interview questions, and this is like much to the chagrin of the people who want to publish this work, I go in and I just give people the opportunity to just share their perspective. Often with patients, I just ask them why they are here today, and what is the experience that they're having. With care team members, I ask them, what is the most important thing that you're trying to accomplish today, and what makes it most challenging? And I find that because usually in healthcare, when a patient goes into a room, they're cut off pretty quickly, and someone's trying to get a very specific piece of information out of them. And they never really feel like they're allowed to tell their entire story from their perspective. And so I sit there and I just give them that opportunity. And more at first, I've really never had kind of at that point a patient say that they don't want to engage with this. They're always interested in supporting other patients and having a better experience or a good experience, so that it's profound how willing they are to be involved with this. But often when I just give them the opportunity to just share things, I'm very often invited to other things. And sometimes I don't have the time to go, but they're like, I'm going for an ultrasound. Do you want to come to that? Not right now, but I appreciate it. And so I will say that in this setting, because these people are at such high points of stress and these things are kind of so scary, that if they can in any way support someone else, they would love to do it. So sorry, that's kind of an easy out answer, but
No, it's a good
I'll
answer.
give
Thanks.
you another example of when people didn't really understand the full patient experience. In chemotherapy, patients are often there for several hours. And we were seeing in our chemotherapy areas, we weren't always completing the required educational modules for these patients. So the doctors had this bright idea. They said, the patients are there for like 2 hours. Why doesn't someone go and give them their patient education while they're sitting in a chair? So I was like, oh, that's actually a great idea. I will go and spend some time and figure out how we can make this work. The thing I learned is that in order to ensure that the patients don't have an allergic reaction to chemotherapy, they're often given a fairly high dose of Benadryl. And Jan, tell me if that is the right term to use in other countries, which makes them very sleepy, which the patients kind of love because they come and this is exhausting and they can take a really good nap and they can sleep really well. So these people were wanting to give all this patient education and everybody was asleep. And so it was just this really interesting thing that people didn't completely understand the whole process. And so they were finding these areas where they could improve it, but it wasn't an improvable service. So I think a warm blanket and a Benadryl was probably the nicest thing that we could do for them. The next thing, and I've talked a little bit about this, is that truly understanding care requires seeing the patient not in isolation, but as a unit with their loved ones or their caregivers and whose experiences and needs are deeply intertwined. And so every time I make a patient experience or a journey, I combine it with a loved one. And this is another experiment that we did with chemotherapy, where we had all of these different chemotherapy chairs that patients could test out because we were building a new space. And we said to the patients when they arrived, which of these 6 lovely chairs would you like to try out? They had massage and they had heat and they had footrests and they had drink holders and they had little TVs by them. And we said, which one would you like to sit in? I'd say at least half of the patients said, get me a folding chair and let this person who drove me to chemotherapy here today sit in that chair. I can sit anywhere. They took the day off of work to bring me. We also found probably the other half of the patients started offering their nurses their chair in the middle of the chemotherapy. Like, you have to try this. It's massaging. It's great. And so they wanted to care for the team. And so we found this really interesting thing is like, as we were designing furniture and spaces, we realized that in order to show the patients that we care for them, we have to show that we're caring for their loved ones, and we have to show that we're caring for our staff so that they didn't feel like they were in a place where they were taking attention away. A few quick process insights that I think are kind of interesting. This is a really fun experiment where we did, so in interventional radiology, so these are kind of like surgical procedures, many of our radiologists work in 2 separate rooms. And so they'll have a case going in room 5 and they'll have a case going in room 3, and they're really only needed for kind of 10 minutes of each case. And they were finding it hard to know when to be in each one. So what we did is we created a mural board. This is a very high-tech experiment that we did. And we put it on a giant screen in the operating room. And then we also had whiteboards that iPads that we posted outside of the room. And then I went into our staff directory and I cut out everybody's head and I put it on this mural board. And I would sit in the ORs and I would move people's heads back and forth in these rooms and show where they were in the space. We would also then show how the case was progressing in each room. When we were done, we showed this to the surgeons and the interventional radiologists, and they told us that this was not useful information. We thought it was great. Then we talked to the allied health staff, and these, again, like the primary care team room, are the ones who are constantly looking for where everybody else is. And they said, this is the most useful thing that I've ever seen, because they could understand where all the staff was. They could understand where the case was. They could understand if I have a question, it looks like they haven't started, so I can go in and ask that question, or it looks like they just got started and I will hold my question. And it created this coordination that even though the people kind of at the top of the pyramid couldn't see the value, the rest of them really understood this profound value. And so we're working on creating a system where we can understand where everyone is in space, where we can understand where they are in time in terms of the case progression. And we can provide that on dashboards so that people can see it no matter what. So you can always find the person who you need to find. We also suspected that people wouldn't love being tracked. And they'd want to know, like, do people think I'm in the bathroom too long? Or do people think that I'm doing things? And because they found such profound value in this, they could care less where we were tracking them. And so it became really interesting that way. So we were very surprised by the results, but I think we still learned something. The next one is what I call maintaining design intent. And so I'm going to give you an example of 2 care team rooms that you could theoretically design. And our intervention was to pass a piece of information between these 2 care teams. And because we were doing something low fidelity, we cut a hole in the wall. We have a printer on each side of the room. The piece of information prints, we pass it through the wall. The other team gets it. It's great. When we go to it, let's say it's successful. And what we had learned is that passing that information between the 2 care teams fundamentally shifts how we provide care. When you go to build these rooms, inevitably, someone will say, oh, we can't put the hole in the wall right where you wanted it. So instead, we're going to have to put a wall 10 feet up and it's 2 inches wide. That's all we can do. But because they had heard you need a hole in the wall to pass information, they do it. So then all of a sudden your project becomes about building the best paper airplane that can pass that information through. When we all know that it could have been an email or a text message or a fax if we want to go way back or anything else. And so being able to maintain design intent, I think in all of our projects is so important so that people understand what we're trying to accomplish and not just put weird holes in walls that aren't useful. Another quick one that I'll share is the need to zoom out. And so this is downtown Rochester, and most of the buildings that you see here are Mayo Clinic, but some of them are hotels. And we had this really interesting group from the University of Iowa, so just south of us, graphic design students who wanted to come and do a project. And what I did is I had them map the perceived boundaries of Mayo Clinic to patients. And what we found is where we felt like clearly, because this is the space that we own and the space that we don't own, that was very different from how the patients perceived the space itself. So it was very interesting to see what we thought was truth and then what patients felt was truth. And it has changed kind of how we approach our wayfinding. Another quick experiment that we did was we wanted to offer our patients more amenities in the hospital, and we couldn't figure out what amenities we should offer. And so I was given a cart and about $100, and I would take a cart with magazines and pillows and warm blankets, snacks, sodas, different things like that. And I would go from room to room and I would offer the patients things. I'd often also say, I can go down to the coffee shop and get you a fancy coffee, whatever you would like. Hilariously, at that point, we were a company that offered Pepsi to our patients. And so everybody wanted a Diet Coke instead. So that was the first thing that was really the only thing I ran out of. Otherwise, people really didn't want anything. But when I surveyed them at the end, about 30% of people remembered that I had given them something that I hadn't. And 80% of patients felt that the amenities that we were offering were really incredible. And so we were able to realize that we can provide an offering that as long as we can deliver on it periodically, the patients perceive value just in the offering itself. This one, and I know I'm almost out of time, so this one is about how kind of patience pays off. Many of the projects that we worked on when we were in the Center for Innovation, this is a digital whiteboard that could do live translation for patients who didn't speak English. And it would show all of their clinical care, their care team, and what was going on with their testing. That was available. We at the Center for Innovation were asked to think about 10 years out. That meant that the ideas were still challenging to implement. And so one of the things that we learned is that we needed to be able to show the value. we needed to be able to continuously articulate that this was an exciting idea, that was an experiment, but it probably couldn't be implemented immediately. And so an ultimate success is for someone else 5 or 6 years down the road to pick up the idea, um, kind of forget that I worked on it, which is very fine with me, and champion it themselves and bring it forward. But when you're thinking about far future things, the idea that something isn't implemented immediately is not a measure that says that it wasn't successful. Instead, it just shows that we need to kind of continuously articulate the use case for it. And then this is kind of my last one and my team hears me say this over and over again, and I'm very passionate about this concept of getting your marbles out of your mouth. And so when I work with any teams, I like to think of them as toddlers who have, and I don't mean that I don't think that they're smart and professional and everything, but this is my analogy, is that they have just loaded a bunch of marbles in their mouth. And you have two options. One, they can choke on them and spit them out throughout the rest of the day. Or you can ask them to nicely spit them out into your hand, and you hand them a toy instead, and we can move on. Many of the meetings that I have are things where people are saying things that are clearly the marbles in the mouth, the things that they need to get out and say before they can progress in anything. And so we'll have a lot of initial meetings where people just need to say stuff to me. They need to tell me about how they don't have a locker in the operating room. They need to tell me about how something completely unrelated to the project is so important to them. And I call those our marbles out of your mouth meetings. I don't tell them this, but my team knows that even if that first meeting kind of completely derails, we can say, okay, those are their marbles. We're aware of their marbles. We can admire their marbles and tell them how nice their marbles are at our other meetings, but they're out and we don't have to choke on them for the rest of the time. So those are all of my random tidbits, and I appreciate you guys all listening to me, but I will kind of in closing say that I feel strongly that the most sophisticated systems should feel the most human. And I really feel that the leading healthcare systems of the future will embrace complexity behind the scenes to deliver care that feels simple, intuitive, and deeply human. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Allison. What a wonderful presentation. We're almost out of time, but I think that we had some kind of question or maybe reflection from Josina up in the chat. Like we might have time to just think about it. And it was one of the things you do best, getting insights from practical experiments in context. Why do you see that as such a useful approach? What kind of resistance or barriers to this approach have you been met with? And how do you move through those barriers?
Yeah, I think I will say, in fairness, I often kind of think of these insights probably 6 months to a year after the project. You do this project, you learn the things you're supposed to learn, and about 6 months later, you're like, oh, what's the interesting thing about this? And so, Justina, I think that one of the things that I do is I bring them up as insights from past projects so they don't have to kind of muddy up that particular project, and actually kind of the looping back process with the stakeholders from those older projects to say, remember when we did that? And remember how this thing was the really, really interesting thing? Is something they actually find value in when they're trying to kind of continuously explain what the intervention was over time. We kind of reinvigorate the conversation. So it's been something that's been pretty useful. And it's usually something that they can kind of say like, oh yeah, that was what was good. So it's been pretty successful that way.